Okay, welcome to this first video in the series when actually we're looking at supply decisions. And then we're looking at these specifically in the perfectly competitive market. We're looking at things like the levels of supply and the levels of production. So let's just start with a reminder. We work on the assumption that firms seek to maximise their profits, and that profit is the difference between the revenue, so the money they make from selling goods or their services, it could be to customers, it could be to third parties or perhaps other businesses, and the costs, things they're responsible for, the labour, the raw materials, the buildings, transport, running machines. So profit is the difference between the revenue and the costs. If we're to consider a production line, and this example I've got here is for aircraft, and we just sort of consider some of the decisions they have to think about when they want to produce or manufacture. So for example, they may decide how many aircraft do we want to build, what type of aircraft do we want to build, and they're going to be making important decisions between these two types of changes that they may make. If we think about the production, if we want to change the production levels, then we can employ some more staff. If the change is relatively small, we could offer overtime, we could buy some other components, and they can transform these components into the product we're making. And it enables us to make relatively small changes. And an example of an aircraft plant, it might be more staff to manufacture more aircraft than they would do normally, perhaps by overtime. It's a small change the business can choose to make at short notice, maybe for a few weeks or for a few months, but it's relatively a short-term need and it can be implemented quite easily. Other changes do actually take longer. So we could build a new factory or buy new machines, and this enables us to make much larger changes, and we could scale up our production by a larger degree. The distinction between these changes is that it can be implemented quickly but may have a relatively small difference on the production, and those which are much larger and take longer to implement. But note though, they both relate to expanding production, but they could easily relate to reducing production. So you could think of laying off staff, reducing hours, buying less components, or then thinking about things like selling factories or selling machinery. We're going to describe two types of inputs, and the input, those which we can change, increase or decrease within a relatively ease in a given period, and we think of this as a variable input. And we describe inputs we can change easily as perhaps things like the staff or the components, so the variable inputs. And then we think about inputs that we can't change quickly in a given time period, fixed inputs. So it's a second type of input, one you can't change, a fixed input. If we look at these variable inputs, in an aircraft for example, it could relate to the staff, numbers of staff you have, the working hours, the components, the purchasing, perhaps the retooling, making 767s instead of 747s, perhaps things where the machines can be altered quite easily. If we think about the fixed inputs, where perhaps the numbers of factories cannot be easily or quickly be altered, and the same with large pieces of equipment. We then think about shorten run, because this actually enables us to look at two time periods, the short run and the long run. So first of all, the short run is a period of time in which at least one input is fixed. So for example, with an aircraft, the period of time to build a new factory could be several years. So we think of that as short run. The long run is a period of time where no inputs are fixed. So perhaps all bets are off. You can make changes, perhaps to staff, components, relatively easy. And these decisions concern supply will be different in the short run or the long run, so very much affects the decision on supply and production. So just recapping, the short run has one input fixed for a period of time, perhaps to build a factory. It could be 2 to 3 years. And on the long run, there's no inputs. So you can actually make your changes relatively swiftly.